I'd like to welcome now Janet Foutty. She is the executive chair of Deloitte LLC, the whole of Deloitte. She has served as CEO and chair of Deloitte Consulting. But before we start, explain to people what that really means, because when most people hear you've gone from CEO to executive chair, it's like, oh, you're kind of sort of stepping back from the day-to-day and you're kind of getting kicked upstairs. Talk a little bit about the structure of Deloitte and what it means in your career path.
Thank you so much. So first of all, before we jump all the way in, I did want to tell you, Bertha, how grateful I am to be able to have what I now see was going to be a very direct conversation with you today, which I'm delighted about. And a huge thank you to Sid and the HACR team for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation. So just a little bit about Deloitte and how I fit into it to address your question directly. So Deloitte is the largest private partnership in the world. We have 4 business units. I had the privilege of serving as the CEO of one of the business units, Deloitte Consulting, for a number of years. For Deloitte as a whole, however, we have 2 elected leaders elected by our 6,000 equity and non-equity partners. And we have a CEO and an executive chair. So I had the privilege of being asked by our board to stand for being elected by our partners about 2.5 years ago into a 4-year term as our executive chair. So I have sort of the ultimate responsibility for stewardship of the partnership. I work very closely with our CEO on a myriad of business strategy as well as operational issues. And it happens that DEI is a tremendous passion of mine. And so I do spend a lot of my time talking and thinking and helping lead within our organization and in the market in and around DEI, amongst other things that I get to focus on. So that's a little bit about our structure and a little bit how I fit into it.
You know, it makes me think a lot about the thing that we are talking about here in terms of networking and mentorship, when it's not just about a hierarchical corporate relationship, but within this kind of framework, you really have to develop relationships with your peers, both above, below, and at your own level, right?
So I love that you just honed in on that so directly and so clearly. So working and living in a partnership does have many wonderful benefits that I've had the opportunity to do over the course of the years. And it is sort of by its nature less hierarchical than one might think of a traditional corporate structure for an organization that large. And it has provided great opportunities to build very different sets of relationships to exactly your point. But as I spend a lot of time out and about with my clients in corporate America, as well as in government, some of the things I've learned in terms of relationship building within a partnership, I think are very, very, and frankly, equally applicable. One of the things that I have learned along the way, and I do spend a lot of time helping others sort of think through, is how to spend your discretionary relationship time. And the advice that I give is that I've certainly found relevant for my career, but also for others, that if you have 10 extra hours a month to spend on relationship building, or 10 extra hours a year, whatever your construct is, my challenge is that you should spend one of those hours building relationships quote unquote above you in the organization. You should spend 5 hours with your team. I do believe that the relationships you build with the people that work on your teams and with you and for you are, for me personally, is the reason that I have the privilege to be here today. And the rest of the hours, those additional 4 hours, should be spent with your peers. And so are upward relationships important for advice, counseling, help, support? Yes. But I believe the depth of relationships that you build with your teams and your peers are frankly the reason I'm here today. And I do think it applies more broadly than just in a private partnership.
Because you build that sense of trust so that when something comes up, someone knows they can rely on you, or someone knows what your strengths and maybe your weaknesses are.
Yeah, so with your peers, it is, I think, exactly that, is that, I do believe my peers give me the most unfiltered, unbiased, no holds barred feedback with a level of transparency and directness that, frankly, as I started my career, I did not appreciate the value in my relationship with my peers, and the stickiest, messiest things I have to sort through. They are my go-to source of help and challenge and feedback. With my teams, or with one's teams, I think the heart of the matter is actually building trust as well, but a trust and confidence. And the way I like to think about it is that I want my teams to know I would walk absolutely over glass for them. I want them to know how deeply invested I am in their success. Sort of one of my principles I've evolved over time is I do believe the best leader's job is really to make everyone around them wildly successful. And for them to know how much you're invested in them. I figured that out relatively early in my career. What I can tell you is it is so much more valuable now, given the complexity of the market landscape. There is no way that as a leader that I can have the intellect, content, smarts, cleverness to solve the variety of problems and topics coming at me in any given day, week, month. The idea that you're an expert in a domain or a topic, and that's what you have to have command of, and you know more than the people that are on your team, has evolved so tremendously. The variety of things that I and we have to deal with as the issues facing us require you to have a team of people who are going to challenge you, compliment you, bring very different perspectives to bear. I think having the best people on your team to that end is critical, and that investment in the relationship and the trust that you build, it has this really wonderful sort of both symbiotic but also magnifying effect in my effectiveness. Because we are so deeply committed to each other's success.
I have to think that this year it's been difficult trying to maintain that, although I would imagine with team members and peers that travel a lot, as they do in your industry and in mine, you always have remote relationships anyway. But this year, obviously with the pandemic, that sort of remote touching base is different.
Yeah, it's funny, when I was a young mother and I became a mom. I've got twins who are now 23 years old. I became a mom right before I became a partner in the firm. And so one of the things I learned,
because you don't like to take on big challenges all at once.
I have sort of this philosophy that you can only plan your life to such an extent, and I clearly have failed that on many levels in terms of orchestrating all these piece parts. But I did learn the importance of deliberateness in investing in relationships beyond. I was so focused on my client and my kids, and that was my whole universe. And I did start to pay a lot more attention to the time and energy I spent in maintaining a broad set of relationships. What I would say today is that in some ways, access and logistics are actually much easier. And the ability to reach out and schedule a quick catch-up or conversation with someone is very different, and is frankly more accessible today through that we're all generally in one place. But what I found is I had to shift the deliberateness. One is to keep making sure you do that and you just don't get consumed by the moment, but also to create the space for connecting more personally, which is not as natural as you would over, if I sat and, you and I sat and we tried to catch up every quarter over a coffee, we would absolutely have professional things we wanted to talk about. But the first 10 minutes of our coffee catch-up would always be around, how's it going? What's new in your life? How can we help each other? And I found in Zoom land that is definitely more awkward, and you have to be more deliberate about that. So that's something I've been trying to really pay attention to, in creating space, not only in one-on-one conversations, but in small group conversations for that. One of the things I've done with my board, because navigating, and we have a relatively large board, navigating a board over Zoom is very different than a board in person. You know, a board in person, we have, first of all, you can see everyone's body language and you understand the landscape a bit more naturally, but we also have breaks and dinners and time in between to have side conversations, both of a business nature and catch up. And I've actually started something. I was really missing that interaction, not just one-on-one, but with small groups. So we've started waffles and wine, with waffles or wine, I shouldn't say waffles, and waffles or wine with my board members, which is we do sort of early in the morning or late in the afternoon, time zone dependent, just pure catch up with 3 to 4 board members at a time, with maybe a slight business agenda, but to really check in on each other. And whether that's over, I actually prefer waffles over wine, but whether that's over, you know, your morning muffin or your glass of wine in the evening has created a little more space for that.
And you don't find that it becomes Zoom fatigue? Because I know I have a couple of college friends who keep wanting to do every quarter checkup, and it just gets to the point where I just had so many Zoom meetings. Even though it's social, I just don't have the energy.
Well, this is a little bit of a hybrid, I think, between social and professional, because it is still all part of sort of the day. You know, there are things that I personally have found certainly very challenging in the times that we're living in. But I do feel that those of us that have the privilege to lead right now live in such rarefied air that I've been able to sort of compartmentalize that. And I've certainly challenged my senior team leaders as well to make sure they're creating the space professionally to have that kind of catch up. But I think it's also, you know, when I think about the things that you asked a good question about sort of how do you stay connected? And I think about the things that were in my DNA as a leader pre-pandemic, and how those have evolved. So health and well-being is a journey that, you know, when I started my career, that was like so low on the totem pole of conversation. It just wasn't discussed at all. It was not in the narrative. And it was all heroics and how long could you go and how little sleep did you have? And obviously the conversation has evolved tremendously around health and well-being. I think this is such an important shining moment for the health and well-being conversation. And really the addition of mental health into that conversation in a much more public and transparent way. So I have really high expectations of my leaders to show up and to make sure that they are there when their teams and their people need them, but to also create the space for their health and well-being as incredibly, incredibly important. So I do think boundaries are even more important in the world that we're living in today than they were.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because this year, you know, with my news director, we might kibitz a bit, and I always worked remotely. Was only occasionally back at HQ when I would see people, so it felt like I was, you know, I don't know, like the border or something. I somehow came home every now and then. but you know, last June, after the George Floyd and all of the protests, you know, obviously it had been a very stressful transition to working from home and dealing with family and making sure we could all make this transition. And like you, I felt very, very privileged that I could do this and do my job this way. But then I remember I was feeling so stressed watching all of those protests and all of the feelings that it erupted. And at one point, my boss just touched in, and I think he sort of, went and wanted to sort of speak to specifically some of us of color. And it was one of those things where I might have been more diffident years ago and sort of said, "Oh, I'm okay, I'm all right." But I was so touched that he genuinely wanted to know, "How are you?" And I told him. It's a whole different conversation now, and it has taken on the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation that we've been having for some time in a very different direction. How has it changed for you? And given that this is an area that you've concentrated on, how has it changed for you, and how has it changed as you've approached it in your business? Are the conversations different now?
So thank you for raising the topic so directly and sharing a little of your personal journey. I feel like I would love to turn around and interview and play your role in this topic as well. So the headline is, it has changed dramatically. So if you go back in time, Deloitte has, been really in a leadership spot around, it was diversity and then inclusion, and then diversity and inclusion, and now layering equity into the conversation. We've really been leading in this conversation in the marketplace since the early 90s, back when I started my career. And we felt that we were an organization that really set an important bar and helped lead in the conversation, starting back, somewhat ironically maybe, with a topic that still sits at the epicenter today, which is around transparency and around commitment to change. Our CEO at the time was frustrated with no action, so he went on the morning news circuit, sort of unheard of at the time, and said, we are going to lead the profession in this space and in this conversation around it was around gender diversity at the time. So we've always led, and we thought we stood, and I stood, and we all stood in a very strong place to lead in the conversation. And what I can tell you is the last 9 months have been incredibly humbling. And that humility, and we're not an arrogant organization, and I don't think of myself as a leader, as someone who sort of sits on her laurels by any stretch and tries to keep pushing myself and my organization. But the last 9 months have created a level of humility and accountability, both around equity and around race in particular, in a very, very different manner. And some of that is that we did create the space for listening. I love your example that that your boss called and said, "How are you?" I feel like, as someone who was a consultant for much of my career, a lot of what I do is I listen to what is important to my clients. I listen to my organization. I talked earlier, you're never thinking that I was the smartest or the person with all the answers in the room. Listening is an important skill. But I think our organization realized that we really needed to listen ask questions and listen in a very different way around what it was like to bluntly to be Black in our organization, to be Black in the business community, and that has created an incredible learning and a very different lens on the accountability that I and we carry for leading this conversation, both within our own organizations and in the community broadly, because I do think the business community has an incredibly important role to play. I had the privilege to spend some time with Valerie Jarrett, and she has this one, I'll paraphrase her wonderful line, which is that government sets the floor, it's business a business that has a responsibility to, to really rise to its fullest heights in addressing the topics around DEI. And I do feel that I've always felt that responsibility and accountability, but it's through a much broader and much, frankly, better informed lens today. So you asked a simple question and I meandered, so I'd love to take that wherever you'd like to.
It's not a simple question. I mean, I remember when I was on the board of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, we had a dinner with the woman who at the time was the head of the Publishers Association. And this was back in the early 90s. So she was saying to us, it would be great if you could have your database better. So when we go and look for, Latino reporters, Hispanic reporters, that we have a base to choose from. And I remember, that's when the Cubana in me kind of came up. And I was like, that's true. We should be better about our computer systems, but how is it when a manager needs to find someone to promote? If it's a white guy who looks just like him, he doesn't need a database. He doesn't need to go to a binder full of recommendations. It just recognizes that person's ability. There's so much talk now about things changing, but I'm wondering, is it just in the moment we're sort of feeling it, it'll pass? Because we have had these moments before, whether it's the 60s coming out of the civil rights movement, and then, sort of in the 70s as more women got into the workforce, and yet we still have these paltry numbers. We still have this inequity. We're celebrating the fact that, oh, we're going to get maybe, a fourth woman in the Fortune 500.
So I absolutely share your question myself about whether this moment is different. We actually have just finished writing and releasing a report called The Equity Imperative, which for us was a really groundbreaking piece of work, which is around the responsibility that organizations have, that corporate America in specificity has, to change the equity conversation for good. Maybe a couple of threads. I actually do believe that this time is different. And there's two signals that I'm seeing that give me that optimism. I think the key is that we have to hold our collective feet to the fire on a sustained basis. But there's two things. So one is that we've broadened the aperture of the conversation outside of or in addition to diversity within our own organizations. So there's no doubt that diversity within our own organizations is incredibly important. And I do think the conversation has changed there. But this idea that there's a broader set of things that we have responsibility for, not just in the people that we hire and invest in and promote, which is, as you point out, has not had enough momentum, but it's around how do you think about the systemic changes in how do we think about the goods and services that we deliver into the market and the lens with which we look at those. How do we think about our supplier, how we spend our money and how we spend our dollars? How do we think about the resources that we put into our communities? And we could spend a whole hour just on this topic. So I do feel that we are chipping away at the problem. We aren't just chipping away at the problem, we're looking at it more holistically. And so I do think the level of conversation holistically is very different. The second thing and change that we're seeing is the pressure, the goodness in the pressure from such a myriad of directions from our employees and people, from the business community at large, and the public commitments from the business community at large, I feel really good about. from the work that the Business Roundtable did last year to the work that there's a number of not-for-profits doing that are going to create accountability and keep pressure into the system from a shared perspective. It's one thing for me, Deloitte, to make a statement and to say, this is what we're committed to. And I do expect, by the way, that journalists will continue to hold our feet to the fire on that, and that's goodness. But I think a lot of that pressure comes from when we sign up with our competitors and our clients collectively for change and action, that I think a lot of sustained momentum is going to come from. And I feel very positive about the early signals around that.
So if I am someone looking to rise, we've got young executives here that are trying to figure out what their next step should be in this environment, do you think that it's a little easier for someone to connect with a mentor, to find someone who's willing to take them on and help them move ahead?
I do think that the collective commitment to women of color, to the Latinx, Latina, Hispanic community there's more attention. So is it easier? I think it would superficially be easy to say yes. I think the trick and where the work is thinking about who you want to develop a relationship for each of you who are having the I hope great joy to participate in this conversation today, albeit we wish it was live, not virtual. Yeah. But it's to think about what matters to you in the mentoring and sponsoring, and I think sponsoring in many cases more important than mentoring, though they're both important. What matters to you out of that relationship? And so do I think it's easier to pick up the phone or the Zoom and get the conversation? I think yes. Do I think it's just as much work to think about what matters to you and how do you evolve and invest in those relationships? I think that transcends the moment that we're in. And I hope that this platform that this wonderful organization has created helps give you some of the tools to do that.
If you were in that position now, you're back 22 years ago, you're about to have
yesterday, so it's not hard to remember.
Right. How would you approach it differently? And what do you think you would do to be able to get more out of the relationship, or what would you think about you wanted to get out of the relationship?
To be honest with you, I joked a little bit earlier that I was focused on my clients and my kids, and that was it for many years as a young executive. And if I participated sometimes in whether it was a program or something that came organically, I probably viewed it a little more as a check the box exercise, as thinking about the give and take that comes with a mentoring and sponsoring relationship. And thinking as much about what can this person learn from me as I can learn from them. Because realizing that for a sustained real relationship, it has to go both ways. And realizing that I had as much to give as I could get, I think would have given me a different lens to how I invested in some of those relationships earlier in my career, because I didn't appreciate that they weren't just that it wasn't check the box on both sides, and really thinking about, if I'm going to spend the time both ways, what can I give in addition to what can I get from this relationship? Which has been a really important learning from me. And when because I'm still in both mentoring and sponsoring, both being and but both sides of those relationships, I'm much more deliberate in thinking about what am I if I'm sponsoring or mentoring someone, I'm very tuned into what am I learning as a really important part of the conversation, in addition to what am I helping with, and
Well,
does get back into that whole symbiotic
yeah,
importance
that
in
makes, well, that's
relationships.
a relationship, right? The relationship can't just be one way.
Exactly.
Well, Janet Foutty, this has been such a great conversation, and certainly have learned a lot, and I have really enjoyed it tremendously. I'm kind of out of words. It feels like we've known each other for so
I
long.
know. Well, like I said, the next time I'm going to get to interview you, it was really a privilege to get to spend time with you today. This is such an important moment, which you've highlighted through your questions and the conversation today. And I guess what I'd like to leave those of you participating today is a couple of things. To know that you matter, and to never, ever, ever forget, with all the chaos that's going around us, that your investment in yourself by participating in this conversation today is incredibly important. And know that there are so many of us out here, both rooting for you and, more importantly, here to help in any way that we can. That's really what this community is all about.
Great note to end on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.